The Zero came out of nowhere. 1 second I was manning my 20mm gun aboard the destroyer USS Heermann, scanning the gray October sky over Leyte Gulf for enemy aircraft, and the next second this Japanese fighter was diving straight at our bridge, its engine screaming like a banshee from hell. The pilot's face was clearly visible through his canopy, young, determined, already dead in his own mind. I could see the rising sun painted on his wings growing larger by the split second. "Kamikaze!" I screamed, swinging my gun around and opening fire. The tracers lit up the dawn sky like deadly fireworks, but the Zero kept coming. This wasn't like the other attacks we'd faced. This pilot wasn't trying to strafe us and escape. He was trying to die and take as many of us with him as possible. My name is Gunner's Mate Second Class Robert Hagen, and what I'm about to tell you is the God's honest truth about the largest naval battle in human history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 23rd–26, 1944. 4 days that changed the course of the Pacific War forever, and introduced us to a new kind of enemy, young Japanese pilots who had transformed their aircraft into manned missiles, trading their lives for the chance to sink American ships. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was October 20th when General MacArthur made his famous return to the Philippines, waiting ashore at Red Beach on Leyte Island with photographers capturing every step. We'd been supporting the invasion for 3 days already, our task unit 77.4. 3, call sign Taffy 3, providing air cover and shore bombardment from our position off Samar Island. Our little group consisted of 6 escort carriers and 7 destroyers. The carriers were small compared to the fleet carriers. We called them Jeep carriers, or baby flat tops. They carried about 30 planes each, mostly FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers. The destroyers were our escorts, my ship Heermann, along with Hoel, Johnston, and Samuel B. Roberts. Technically Roberts was a destroyer escort, smaller and more lightly armed than a proper destroyer. I'd been in the Navy since 1942, seen action at Guadalcanal and the Marshalls, but nothing had prepared me for what was coming. The Japanese were planning something big. We could feel it in the air, like the electric tension before a thunderstorm. Admiral Halsey had taken his powerful Task Force 38 north, chasing what he thought was the main Japanese fleet. That left us covering the landing beaches with our small escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. We didn't know it yet, but we were about to face the largest and most powerful surface fleet the Japanese Navy could muster. October 24th started quietly enough. I was cleaning my gun when the call came over the 1MC, General Quarters, General Quarters. All hands man your battle stations. The alarm bells were ringing, and men were running across the deck in their life jackets and helmets. I took my position at gun mount 24, one of the 20mm Oerlikon cannons on the starboard side. The sea was choppy, with swells running about 4 feet. The sky was overcast, with scattered clouds at about 3,000 feet. Perfect flying weather, unfortunately. Contact, bearing 090, range 15 miles, came the voice from the Combat Information Center. Multiple bogies inbound. This was it. The Japanese were coming. The first attack came around 0730. 24 Japanese planes, a mix of Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo planes, approached from the east. Our combat air patrol, 4 Wildcats from the carrier Gambier Bay, intercepted them about 10 miles out. I watched through my binoculars as the dogfight developed. The Wildcats were outnumbered 6-1, but those Marine and Navy pilots were magnificent. They dove into the Japanese formation with guns blazing, breaking up their coordinated attack. One Judy got through and made a dive on Gambier Bay. I watched it plummet down at a 70-degree angle, the pilot holding his dive until the last possible second. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts of flak, but the Judy kept coming. At 1,500 feet, something was different. Instead of releasing his bomb and pulling out, the pilot kept diving. Straight at the carrier's flight deck, muttered Seaman Johnson, who was feeding ammunition to my gun. He's not pulling out. The Judy hit Gambier Bay just aft of the island, crashing through the flight deck in a ball of fire and twisted metal. It was the first time I'd seen anything like it, a pilot deliberately crashing his plane into a ship. We didn't have a word for it yet. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was still coming. At 0645 on October 25th, I was drinking coffee and eating powdered eggs when Ensign Brooks came running up from the radio room. His face white as a sheet. Enemy surface ships, bearing 340 degrees, distance 17 miles, he announced to our gun crew. Looks like battleships and cruisers. Lots of them. I nearly choked on my coffee. Enemy surface ships? Out here? Admiral Halsey was supposed to be covering the northern approaches with his battleships and carriers. What the hell were Japanese battleships doing in our backyard? The answer, we learned later, was that Admiral Kurita's center force had slipped through San Bernardino Strait during the night. 23 ships, including the super battleships Yamato and Nagato, 4 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Midway, bearing down on our small task unit of escort carriers and destroyers. We were David facing Goliath, except Goliath had 18-inch guns, and we had pea shooters. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding our task unit from the carrier Fanshawe Bay, immediately ordered us to make smoke and retreat south at maximum speed. The carriers could make about 17 knots, we destroyers could do 35 knots, but we had to stay with our charges. This is going to be a fighting withdrawal, boys, announced our skipper, Commander Amos Hathaway, over the ship's intercom. We're going to lay smoke, fire torpedoes, and make those bastards pay for every mile. At 0658, the Japanese opened fire. I'll never forget the sound of those first salvos from Yamato's 18-inch guns. Like thunder rolling across the water, followed by the whistle of shells the size of small automobiles passing overhead. The Japanese were firing at maximum range, about 35,000 yards, but even at that distance, their shells were deadly accurate. The first salvo straddled Fanshawe Bay, sending up columns of water taller than our mast. If those shells had hit, they would have blown the carrier in half. All ahead flank, ordered Commander Hathaway. Make smoke. Our engineers pushed the boilers beyond their rated capacity, and thick black smoke poured from our stack. All 7 escorts began laying smoke, creating a screen to hide the carriers. But smoke wouldn't stop 18-inch shells. At 0716, Commander Hathaway made the decision that saved the task unit and probably changed the course of the battle. Left full rudder, he ordered. We're going in. Heermann, Hoel, and Johnston turned toward the enemy fleet and began our torpedo run. It was suicide. 3 destroyers charging 23 enemy ships, including the 2 most powerful battleships ever built. But it was also our duty. I watched from my gun position as the Japanese fleet grew larger on the horizon. Yamato was unmistakable, a floating fortress bristling with guns. Her main battery turrets were the size of 3-story buildings, each gun barrel as long as a football field. At 0730, we opened fire with our 5-inch guns at a range of 18,000 yards. The shells looked like tiny sparks arcing across the morning sky. We might as well have been throwing pebbles at a locomotive, but every hit helped. The Japanese returned fire with everything they had. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, even the battleships were shooting at us. The sea around Heermann erupted in towering geysers as enemy shells bracketed us. Commander Hathaway was conducting the ship like a symphony, ordering course changes every few seconds to throw off the enemy's aim. Left 10 degrees rudder. Steady as she goes. Right 15 degrees rudder. At 0754, we reached torpedo range. 10,000 yards, still suicidal for a destroyer, but close enough for our Mark 15 torpedoes to have a reasonable chance of hitting. Fire 1. Fire 2. Fire 3. The torpedo officer's voice carried clearly over the noise of battle. I felt the ship shudder as each torpedo left its tube. We fired all 10 torpedoes in a spread aimed at the leading Japanese cruiser, Haguro. Then we swung hard to starboard and ran like hell, laying smoke and zigzagging to avoid the forest of shell splashes pursuing us. While we were making our torpedo attack, something extraordinary was happening behind us. The escort carriers, those little jeep carriers that everyone thought were too small and slow to matter, were launching every plane they had. Wildcats, Avengers, even some Army P-38 Lightnings that had been flying close air support for the troops on Leyte, everything that could fly was heading for Kurita's fleet. Many of the planes were armed only with machine gun ammunition. Some carried depth charges intended for submarines, but they attacked anyway. I watched an Avenger from Gambier Bay make a torpedo run on Yamato. The pilot took his plane down to mast height, skimming the waves at 200 knots, while every gun in the Japanese fleet tried to swat him down. Somehow he made it through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire and dropped his torpedo at point-blank range. The torpedo missed, but the attack forced Yamato to turn away, disrupting the Japanese formation and buying precious time for our carriers to escape. At 0810, disaster struck. Gambier Bay, slowest of our carriers, took a direct hit from an 8-inch shell from the heavy cruiser Chikuma. I watched from 3 miles away as the shell punched through her flight deck and exploded in her hangar bay. Secondary explosions lit up the morning sky, and she began to list to port. 10 minutes later, another salvo from Chikuma hit her amidships. Gambier Bay was finished. She rolled over and sank stern first at 0857, taking 147 of her crew with her. She was the first and only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by naval gunfire. But her sacrifice wasn't in vain. While the Japanese were concentrating their fire on Gambier Bay, our 3 destroyers were wreaking havoc on the enemy formation. Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, had charged straight into the middle of the Japanese fleet like a berserk warrior. Her 5-inch guns were firing so fast that the paint was burning off the barrels, and she put 3 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Hoel, under Commander Leon Kintberger, had engaged Yamato herself. A destroyer trading punches with a super battleship, it should have been impossible, but Kintberger's aggressive maneuvering kept his ship alive for almost an hour, scoring several 5-inch hits on the battleship's superstructure. As for us aboard Heermann, we were living charmed lives. Commander Hathaway's ship handling was inspired. He seemed to anticipate every enemy salvo, turning the ship just as the shells arrived. We'd been hit 3 times by smaller caliber shells, but nothing vital was damaged. At 0905, our torpedo attack finally paid off. 2 of our torpedoes struck Haguro, the Japanese heavy cruiser that had been leading the attack. I saw the flashes of the explosions on her port side, followed by a column of black smoke. She dropped out of formation, listing heavily. That's when I saw my first real kamikaze attack. It was 0930, and we were still retreating south, dodging shells from the pursuing Japanese fleet. The carriers were launching planes as fast as they could spot them on deck, anything to keep pressure on Kurita's ships. I was scanning the sky for enemy aircraft when I spotted them, 6 Japanese planes approaching from the northeast, flying low and fast. At first I thought they were conventional attackers, but something was wrong. They weren't maneuvering to avoid our anti-aircraft fire. They were flying straight and level, heading directly for our ships. Air attack! Air attack! Came the call from the bridge. All guns, commence firing. I swung my 20mm gun around and opened fire on the lead plane, a Judy dive bomber. My tracers reached out toward him, but he didn't even try to evade. He just kept coming, boring straight in toward the carrier Callinan Bay. The entire task unit erupted in anti-aircraft fire. Every 5-inch gun, every 40mm Bofors, every 20mm Oerlikon was hammering at those 6 Japanese planes. The sky filled with black puffs of flak and streams of tracers. 3 of the planes were shot down, disintegrating in mid-air or crashing into the sea. But 3 got through. The first Judy hit Kalinin Bay on her port quarter, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay. The second plane, a Zero fighter loaded with a bomb, crashed into the destroyer hold just as she was launching her final torpedo at Yamato. The explosion killed 12 men instantly and knocked out her after engine room. The third plane was the one I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the Zero that came diving straight at our bridge. I'd been tracking him with my gun, pouring 20mm shells into his engine, when he suddenly rolled inverted and dove straight down. For a second, it looked like he was going to hit us amidships. But at the last moment, he pulled out of his dive and skimmed along our starboard side, so close I could see the expression on his face. He was young, maybe 20 years old, with a white Hachimaki headband tied around his helmet. His eyes were wide, but not with fear, with determination. He pulled up sharply and banked toward Fanshawe Bay, our flagship. Admiral Sprague's carrier was about 800 yards off our port quarter, her flight deck crowded with planes preparing to launch. "He's going for the Admiral," shouted Seaman Johnson. I traversed my gun as fast as I could and opened fire again. This time my tracers found their mark, stitching across the Zero's fuselage and wing root. Black smoke poured from his engine, but still he kept flying. The Zero hit Fanshawe Bay's flight deck at the base of her island, exploding in a ball of orange fire. The concussion knocked me backward against the gun shield, and burning aviation gasoline rained down on the water around both ships. When the smoke cleared, I could see that the Kamikaze had punched a hole clean through the flight deck. But Fanshawe Bay was still afloat, still making way. Her damage control teams were already fighting the fires. These suicide attacks were something new and terrifying. We'd always known the Japanese would fight to the death, but this was different. This was turning death itself into a weapon. At 0911, something incredible happened. The Japanese fleet, which had been pursuing us relentlessly for over 2 hours, suddenly turned around and headed north. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, had lost his nerve. The ferocious resistance put up by our destroyers and the constant air attacks from the escort carriers had convinced him that he was facing a major American fleet, not the handful of small ships we actually had. In reality, Kurita had the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. His ships mounted over 400 heavy guns, compared to our 16 5-inch guns. He could have annihilated our task unit, and then proceeded to massacre the invasion transports in Leyte Gulf. Instead, he turned away, convinced he was outgunned. It was one of the great bluffs in naval history, and it worked. But the cost had been terrible. Gambier Bay was gone, along with 147 of her crew. Hoel was sinking, her back broken by Kamikaze hit and repeated shell strikes. Johnston was dead in the water, her forward magazine exploded and her bridge shot away. Commander Evans, wounded and covered in blood, was still directing what guns he had left from the after-conning station. Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship, had taken so many hits that she looked more like a floating scrapyard than a warship. But she was still fighting, her single 5-inch gun firing its last rounds at the retreating Japanese fleet. As for Heermann, we'd taken a beating, but we were still afloat. 3 hits from Japanese shells had punched holes in our hull and superstructure, and our after stack was shot away, but Chief Engineer Lieutenant Morrison had kept our engines running throughout the battle. At 10:12, Johnston finally gave up the fight. She rolled over to port and sank by the bow, taking Commander Evans and 185 of his crew with her. 20 minutes later, Samuel B. Roberts followed her to the bottom. Hoel had already gone down at 0855. In 3 hours of desperate fighting, we'd lost 3 destroyers and 1 escort carrier. But we'd saved the invasion force and probably shortened the war by months. The surface battle was over, but the air attacks continued throughout October 25 then 26. And more of them were suicide attacks. The Japanese had discovered that a single plane, flown by a pilot willing to die, could do more damage than a dozen conventional bombing attacks. A kamikaze couldn't miss. He aimed his entire aircraft at the target, and even if anti-aircraft fire damaged his plane, momentum would carry the wreckage into his target. On the afternoon of October 25th, we were screening the remaining carriers when the largest kamikaze attack yet developed. 16 Japanese planes, all loaded with bombs and extra fuel for maximum destructive effect, approached our formation from the west. This time we were ready for them. The carriers had launched every fighter they could get airborne, and our radar had given us early warning. The Wildcats intercepted the Kamikaze 15 miles out and shot down 9 of them in a running dogfight that lasted 20 minutes. But 7 got through. I watched from my gun position as they dove on the carriers. These weren't the hasty, improvised attacks we'd seen earlier. These pilots had been trained specifically for suicide missions. They knew exactly how to attack a carrier for maximum damage. 1-0 dove on Kitkin Bay from directly astern, following the path that would take him right into the ship's vitals. The carrier's 40mm guns were firing constantly, filling the air around the diving plane with explosive shells. The Zero was hit repeatedly, pieces flying off its wings and fuselage, but it kept coming. At 200 feet, the pilot pulled out of his dive and leveled off, skimming just above the flight deck. I could see him clearly in his cockpit, hunched over his controls, flying his crippled plane with pure willpower. He hit the flight deck just forward of the island, his 500-pound bomb exploding a split second after impact. The blast blew a hole 40 feet across through the wooden deck and into the hangar below. Burning aviation gasoline poured through the hole like a waterfall of fire. Kitkin Bay shuddered from stem to stern, her flight operations knocked out completely. But her damage control teams performed miracles, containing the fires and keeping her afloat. She would make it back to port for repairs. 2 more Kamikaze hit St. Lo, the smallest of our escort carriers. The first crashed into her flight deck near the forward elevator, starting fires in the hangar bay. The second hit her port side near the waterline, flooding several compartments. For a few minutes, it looked like St. Lo might survive. Her crew was fighting the fires, and she was still making headway. Then, at 10:56, her torpedo storage exploded. The blast lifted the entire forward half of the ship out of the water. When it came down, St. Lo broke in half and sank in less than 30 minutes. She was the first ship ever sunk by a kamikaze attack. By the evening of October 26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. The Japanese had committed virtually their entire remaining fleet to the operation, and they had been decisively defeated. In 4 days of fighting, they lost 26 ships sunk and 173 aircraft destroyed. More importantly, they lost most of their remaining experienced pilots and naval officers. The Japanese Navy would never again be capable of offensive operations. But the victory had come at a cost that went beyond mere numbers. The kamikaze attacks had introduced a new dimension to naval warfare, an enemy who saw death rather than avoided it, who turned his own destruction into a weapon. Sitting on deck that evening, cleaning my gun for the 100th time that week, I tried to process what I'd witnessed. The conventional surface battle had been terrifying but familiar, ships shooting at ships, the side with better gunnery and tactics winning. But the suicide attacks were something else entirely. I thought about that young Japanese pilot I'd seen diving at our bridge, the determination in his eyes as he flew his plane into certain death. He couldn't have been much older than my younger brother back in Ohio. What could drive a person to make that choice? Later, I learned that the Japanese called these attacks kamikaze after the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion in 1274. They believed that the spirits of dead warriors would guide their planes to their targets, that death in such an attack guaranteed entry into their warrior's paradise. Whether you believed in their mythology or not, you had to respect their courage. It takes a special kind of bravery to fly into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire, knowing you'll never see another sunset. We buried our dead at sea on October 27. 23 men from Heermann had been killed in the battle, including Seaman Johnston, who'd been feeding ammunition to my gun when a shell fragment caught him in the chest. The service was held on the fantail, with the crew standing at attention while Chaplain Morrison read from the Book of Common Prayer. Commander Hathaway spoke about duty and sacrifice, about how these men had died defending democracy and freedom. As each body slipped beneath the waves, wrapped in canvas, and weighted with 5-inch shells, I thought about the randomness of survival. Why had I lived when Johnston died? Why had our ship survived when 3 others hadn't? There were no answers, only the certainty that we'd been through something that would mark us for the rest of our lives. The butcher's bill for Taffy 3 was severe: 2 carriers and 3 destroyers sunk, over 1,500 men killed or missing. But we'd saved the invasion force and dealt the Japanese Navy a blow from which it would never recover. More importantly, we'd learned how to fight Kamikaze, the lessons learned off Samar: early radar detection, fighter interception, concentrated anti-aircraft fire, would save countless American lives in the battles to come. Because this was just the beginning. The young Japan pilot who dove at our bridge was one of the first of thousands who would follow his example in the months ahead. Leyte Gulf had opened the door to the divine wind, and it would blow with increasing fury all the way to the shores of Japan itself. Looking back now, more than 70 years later, I understand that the Battle of Leyte Gulf was a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in the nature of warfare itself. It was the last great surface action between battleships, the end of the era when naval battles were decided by the size of your guns and the thickness of your armor. The future belonged to aircraft carriers and their planes, including the Kamikaze aircraft that had made their debut in our battle. Within 6 months, thousands of young Japanese pilots would follow the example set off Samar, turning themselves into guided missiles in a last desperate attempt to stave off defeat. The Kamikaze attacks would reach their peak during the invasion of Okinawa in 1945, when over 1,900 suicide sorties would be flown against the American fleet. By then, we'd learned how to defend against them: radar-directed fighter interceptions, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and combat air patrols that could break up the attacks before they reached our ships. But at Leyte Gulf, they were something new and terrifying. We were improvising our defenses, learning through trial and error how to fight an enemy who welcomed death. The Japanese strategy ultimately failed. The Kamikaze attacks, for all their psychological impact, couldn't overcome American industrial might and technological superiority. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a defeated nation, kept alive only by the determination of its military leaders to fight to the bitter end. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally ended the war, sparing both sides the massive casualties that would have resulted from an invasion of Japan. But for those of us who had faced the Kamikaze off Samar, the bombs came as a relief. We knew what Japanese desperation could accomplish when channeled into willing self-sacrifice. Heermann survived the war, as did most of her crew. We went on to support the invasions of Luzon and Okinawa, facing more kamikaze attacks and losing more shipmates. But nothing ever matched the intensity of those 4 days in October 1944, when we stood alone against the mightiest fleet Japan could muster. The ship was decommissioned in 1946 and eventually scrapped, but the men who served aboard her carried the memory of Leyte Gulf for the rest of their lives. We held reunions every October 25th, gathering to remember our fallen shipmates and the day we helped change the course of history. Commander Hathaway received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the battle. Chief Engineer Morrison was promoted and given command of his own destroyer. As for me, I stayed in the Navy for another 8 years, serving aboard cruisers and destroyers until 1953. But I never forgot the young Japanese pilot who dove at our bridge that October morning. In my dreams, I still see his face, determined, unafraid, already committed to death for his emperor and his country. He was my enemy, and I did my best to kill him, but I could not help respecting his courage. War makes enemies of men who might have been friends in other circumstances. The pilot who tried to crash into our ship might have been a farmer, or a teacher, or an artist in peacetime. Instead, he became a weapon, a guided missile aimed at my shipmates and me. That's the true cost of war, not just the ships sunk and the lives lost, but the human potential destroyed, the young men who never got the chance to become the people they might have been. The Battle of Leyte Gulf saved American lives and shortened the war, but it also marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare where death itself became a weapon. In the end, courage and sacrifice were not enough to save Japan from defeat. But for 4 days in October 1944, off the coast of Samar Island, Japanese and American sailors showed the world what men could accomplish when they were willing to die for something greater than themselves. We won the battle, and ultimately the war, but victory came at a price measured not just in ships and planes, but in the innocence lost when we learned that our enemies could turn death itself into a weapon. The divine wind had begun to blow, and it would not stop until the last shot was fired and the last kamikaze fell burning into the sea. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over, but for those of us who survived it, the war would never truly end. It lives on in our memories, in the faces of the shipmates we lost, and in the lesson we learned that October morning, that in war, there are no limits to what desperate men will do when they believe their cause is just. That young Japanese pilot taught me something about courage that I've never forgotten. Even though he was trying to kill me and my shipmates, I respected his willingness to die for his beliefs. It was a terrible, beautiful thing, the kind of sacrifice that war demands, and that civilized people hope they'll never have to witness. But witness it we did, and survive it we must, carrying the memory forward, so that future generations will understand the true cost of the freedom they inherit. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history. But for those of us who fought it, it will always be remembered as the day we learned that even death could be weaponized, and that victory would require us to match our enemies' willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause we served. Steel thunder had rolled across the Pacific, and when the smoke cleared, the world had changed forever.